Last week, the Sega Dreamcast turned 19 years old in North America. Gone, but certainly not forgotten, the Dreamcast changed the landscape of gaming as we knew it. Releasing in North America in 1999, it came bundled with a modem for online capabilities and boasted an impressive launch lineup including arcade-quality versions of Soul Calibur, House of the Dead 2, and Capcom's Power Stone.
I don't want to die! My God.
The Sega Dreamcast was the first and one of only two consoles to ever feature VGA output, the other incidentally being the Xbox 360. On the surface, VGA seemed to be an odd choice. If you look at the competition at the time, the Xbox, GameCube and PlayStation 2 all had component outputs. But if we dig deeper, the reason why Sega likely opted for VGA is due to the strong connection the Dreamcast had with Sega arcade hardware that was built with very similar specs, which was known as Naomi. The Sega Naomi arcade hardware was released in 1998 and stands for New Arcade Operators Machine Idea and was the successor to the Model 3 arcade hardware. The first arcade game released on the Naomi, incidentally, was House of the Dead 2. While it's not clear which machine came first, the Dreamcast or the Naomi, what is known is Sega wanted the Dreamcast to match the specs of the Naomi and bring quality arcade games to the home. The Dreamcast runs a Hitachi SH4 RISC processor clocked at 200 MHz. For its GPU, it runs an NEC PowerVR 2 at 100 MHz. The Dreamcast has 16 MB of main memory, 8 MB of video RAM, and 2 MB for its sound. Game media is of course the proprietary GD-ROM format capable of storing up to 1.2 GB of data on a single disc. The Sega Naomi shares the exact same processor, graphics and sound chips as the Dreamcast, but it has double the main memory, graphics and sound memory. The Sega Naomi 2, which is the hardware that I have, was released in 2000 and is fully backward compatible with the Naomi 1, with the main difference that it has two PowerVR GPUs, increased memory and faster bandwidth. As a comparison for performance, the Dreamcast and Naomi can push 3 million polygons per second, while the Naomi 2 can push up to 10 million per second. Looking at the back of the Naomi 1 and 2, there is no 56-pin jammer interface that we would normally associate with arcade hardware of this nature, but instead we have a VGA connector, audio RCA connectors, and power connectors. This combination is known as JVS or Jammer Video Standard. JVS was created in the mid-90s to improve on the shortcomings of the Jammer standard. There are three different ways to load arcade games on the Naomi. The first are cartridges. These are of a distinct plastic shape and are simply inserted into the motherboard. These cartridges can store up to 448 MB of data on its ROM chips. An arcade operator would simply swap out the game cartridges if they wanted a new game on the cabinet. Larger games came on GD-ROM media. These are similar in format to the Dreamcast, but not compatible. Incidentally, attempting to boot a Naomi GD-ROM on the Dreamcast results in this interesting message.
This is a game disc for Naomi GD-ROM system. You cannot play this with the Dreamcast. The first track contains game data, so do not play this with a CD player.
The GD-ROM was an add-on to the Naomi that interfaced to a special cartridge known as a DIM board. The DIM board contains up to 570 MB of RAM. The board loads the entire GD-ROM into memory to reduce on drive access and wear and tear on the GD-ROM. These are notorious for breaking down easily. The DIM board also contains a battery to save the contents of RAM, which significantly speeds up boot time if the same game is used. In order to stop piracy, each GD-ROM comes with a security chip. This contains a unique code that's tied to the game. In order to play a GD-ROM game, you must insert the security chip into the DIM board before turning on the power to boot up the game. If you try using a security chip from another game, the game will not boot. So, many years ago, I owned a GD-ROM setup, and I made a couple of videos back in 2012 demonstrating the GD-ROM setup that I had. Now, I don't really recommend anyone go back and revisit these videos. They're pretty bad, but if you are curious, check them out. But I got rid of this setup in favor of a very simple way to boot Naomi games remotely utilizing a PC or a Raspberry Pi to a device called a NetDIMM. The NetDIMM takes all the same features as the DIMM board, but also provides TCP/IP networking functionality and a networking connection. This means with a simple network interface, Naomi games can be sent over the network from a remote device, such as a PC or similar. And of course, in this day and age, you can use a Raspberry Pi to manage this for you. But more on that shortly. I mentioned that at the back of the Naomi motherboard has a VGA output, audio outs, and power. So how do we go about connecting it up to a JAMMA arcade cabinet? You would use what's called an I/O board. This board, known as the Capcom I/O, interfaces to the Naomi via the USB connection. The I/O board will route the audio, video and controller to the JAMMA edge. There's also an additional input for a kick harness for any 6-button game such as Street Fighter Upper 3 or Marvel vs. Capcom 2. The I/O board requires its own power, either from the JAMMA interface or via its own dedicated power supply. So, if you are wanting to put together your own home Naomi setup, it can get a little daunting and overwhelming. There are different pieces that you have to consider when putting together a setup like this. Now, typically I would recommend that you use an arcade cabinet to put the whole system in, because one of the main side effects of the Naomi setup, if you just leave it bare bones on a desk or something, is that it gets extremely loud. The fans run at 100% capacity all the time. And this is because this is dedicated arcade hardware and they have to be running all the time, because these setups usually are running 24/7. So it's important that the maximum airflow or the hot air gets blown out of the system all the time, because these systems have to run constantly at full capacity. So to connect everything up, we will need a power supply. These are dedicated power supplies made for the Naomi with the appropriate connectors needed for the Naomi motherboard. Mine was previously butchered for some reason, but still works fine and includes the GD-ROM power connector also if needed. Connect up the two power leads to the Naomi motherboard. Then connect the USB cable from the motherboard to the Capcom I/O board. Now plug in the JAMMA edge into a supergun. Then connect up the VGA cable to a display that takes a 31 kHz VGA signal. With the Naomi, you can also change the frequency to 15 kHz if your display doesn't support 31 kHz. Then finally, plug in your game cartridge and then turn the power on. With any luck, you will go through the boot process and boot into the game. To netboot or boot GD-ROM games from the Raspberry Pi, replace the game cartridge with the NetDIMM. Then connect the network adapter to the Raspberry Pi device and connect the +5 power lead from the Raspberry Pi to the back of the motherboard. Now turn everything on. The Naomi will be sitting at the netboot screen. It's waiting for a game to be sent over the network. Now with the Raspberry Pi, scroll through the list of games until you find the one you want, and then press select to boot into it. This process may take a minute or two as it sends the entire game over the network into the NetDIMM's RAM, and then it will reboot the Naomi into the game proper. From here, you can coin up and play as normal. As we've seen, the Naomi and the Dreamcast are very similar, and many games that were developed on the arcade have almost perfect home console conversions to the Dreamcast. Here's a sample of a few. It's also worth mentioning that the Naomi has some games that never made it to any home console. And finally, unlike the Dreamcast, Naomi hardware was one of the longest supported, spanning 2 generations. Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution, for example, made its way to the PlayStation 2, but games were made for the Naomi even after the PlayStation 2 and Dreamcast had been discontinued all the way up to 2009. Radaji Noah is one of the last ever shoot-'em-up Naomi titles that was released in 2009 that was ported to the Nintendo Wii. The Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 also received Naomi ports. So in conclusion, even though the Dreamcast only lasted a short while before being discontinued in 2001, its legacy lived on in the arcades with the Naomi. And with so many fantastic arcade games that still look and play great to this day, the Sega Naomi is one piece of hardware that I'm glad to have as part of my collection. Well guys, I'm going to leave it at that for this video. Let me know what you thought about the Sega Naomi arcade hardware in the comments below. If you have any questions about what you saw in this video or anything else, let me know. As always guys, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.